You dare bring your mongrel children into the crystal halls? Queen Sarilith's voice cut across the chamber, sharp as a blade of light. The nobles around her laughed, their jeweled collars chiming as if mockery itself was music. Humans are permitted to sweep these corridors, not walk them with pride. Elias Rourke didn't answer right away. His hammer rested against his shoulder, old steel scarred by years of use. The alien saw it as little more than scrap. He let the silence hold, then tapped the head of the hammer gently against the crystal floor. The sound carried strangely in the vast chamber, low, resonant, steady. A reminder that even ancient tools left echoes in places where arrogance thought itself eternal. You'll want to see how the moment they mocked him turned into a galaxy-wide reckoning. What looked like humiliation was the opening chord of something none of them understood. He finally spoke, his voice measured, quiet. A corridor's shine doesn't decide its worth. What matters is what holds it together when it cracks. He didn't look at the queen. He looked at his twin standing behind him. Calm, deliberate, unshakable, like a man who had already endured worse storms than their laughter. Leora, his daughter, clutched at his sleeve, her silver-streaked eyes wide and afraid. Kale, his son, kept his chin up but pressed close, too small to hide the tremble in his hands. They had inherited more than his stubborn jawline. Their alien blood had painted their skin with a faint shimmer, and that alone was enough for Sarilith's court to treat them as curiosities, or worse, defects. Elias bent slightly, lowering the hammer, and whispered so only they could hear, "No one defines you but yourself. Not here, not ever." Their fear settled into silence, and he felt their breathing slow. That was his victory, small but essential. It didn't matter how many nobles sneered above. In that moment, his children believed him more than they feared the queen. The chamber glittered with the alien luxury of the academy, walls that pulsed with harmonic light, floors that rippled faintly like liquid glass. Nobles paraded in robes threaded with living crystal. Every gesture meant to remind the janitor of his station. But Elias's patched uniform told its own story. Each mark was a day survived. Each repair stitched by his own hand was proof that humility and resilience outlasted ornament. He knew they saw him as dirt. And still, he stood with his back straight, eyes calm, twins at his side. He wasn't here to fight their empire. He was here to make sure his children knew what dignity looked like when surrounded by contempt. "Where are you watching from?" He might have asked if he could look past the chamber walls into the eyes of those who would one day hear his story. Because humiliation this public, this cruel, wasn't just personal. It belonged to anyone who had ever been laughed at for standing in the wrong place, with the wrong face. The queen leaned back on her throne of starlight. "You cling to your tool as if it grants you standing," she sneered, gesturing toward the hammer, a relic of a primitive world, a symbol of nothing. Elias let her words hang. Then he touched the worn handle with a father's familiarity and gave the smallest of smiles. "This hammer has built more than you'll ever understand." He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. The weight of quiet truth was heavier than any declaration. The nobles laughed again, but the sound had thinned. Somewhere deep inside the crystalline walls, the harmonic hum of the star core wavered, too subtle for most to notice. Elias did. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. They thought he was only a janitor. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The chamber's laughter still echoed when Elias lowered his gaze from the queen's throne to the crystalline floor. The nobles' smug expressions glittered as brightly as their jeweled collars, every sneer sharpened by alien arrogance. His twins stayed close, silent, bracing themselves against a tide of ridicule too heavy for children to carry. He felt their weight pressing into him, and it anchored him against the storm of mockery. Chancellor Vadrin stepped forward from the line of advisors, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "Your Majesty, it is unseemly for a human laborer to linger in the gallery during inspection, particularly with offspring that dilute the Academy's bloodlines." The word offspring slid from his mouth like poison, carefully measured to draw more laughter. He gestured toward the Starcore Gallery's open arch. Humans have their place in service halls, not standing beside the Empire's heart. Elias said nothing. Instead, he let his hand tighten just slightly on the hammer's handle, not raising it, just reminding himself it was there. The old steel was warm against his palm, familiar as breath. He knew what the nobles couldn't. The Starcore's hum wasn't steady. It skipped, faint and sharp, like a strained heartbeat. None of them noticed, too consumed with spectacle. He didn't need to announce it yet. His children's calm came first. Leora tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Why do they hate us, Papa?" The words cut deeper than any sneer. He bent his head and whispered back, steady as stone, "Because they don't understand us, and people fear what they don't understand." Her small nod steadied him as much as his words steadied her. Quayle's eyes fixed on the Starcore chamber. "It doesn't sound right," he murmured, barely audible. Elias blinked, surprised. The boy had noticed what the aliens hadn't. Pride flared in his chest, quiet but fierce. His children were already listening closer than nobles who thought themselves wise. Chancellor Vadrin's voice swelled again, meant for the Queen, but loud enough to carry through the hall. "Shall I escort this janitor and his brood back to the servant quarters? His presence distracts from the inspection." He bowed low, false humility hiding his satisfaction. The court tittered, eyes bright with cruelty. The Queen raised one elegant hand, crystalline rings flashing. "Do so," she said, her tone dismissive. "The sight of them offends." Elias lifted his chin. His voice, when it came, was calm. "I'll leave when the gallery is safe." The statement landed oddly in the chamber, not defiant enough to be treason, but not obedient enough to be ignored. A murmur rippled through the nobles. Vadrin's eyes narrowed. "What nonsense is this?" the Chancellor demanded, stepping closer. "The gallery has stood for centuries. Your hammer won't be the thing to decide its safety." Elias's gaze flicked toward the glowing walls beyond the arch, their harmonic light trembling just faintly. He could feel the vibration in the soles of his boots. The instability was growing. He chose his words with care. If a servant says nothing when the walls are cracking, who will? The chamber fell silent for a breath. Then came the laughter again, sharper, louder, meant to drown him out. But under it, the harmonic hum wavered once more. His fingers flexed around the hammer. He said no more. Not yet. He turned instead toward his children. "We'll walk," he murmured, guiding them toward the gallery's threshold. Nobles muttered, some scandalized, others amused, as the human janitor moved further into the chamber than etiquette allowed. Vadrin barked after him, "You have no right," but Elias ignored the words. His eyes were on the Starcore itself, suspended in its crystalline chamber. Light pulsed unevenly, a rhythm faltering beneath its radiance. To anyone else, it was a trick of reflection. To him, it was a warning. The twins looked up at him, uncertain. "Papa?" Quayle asked softly. He crouched so he could meet their eyes, the hammer balanced across his knees. "Remember this," he said quietly. "Sometimes the smallest sound tells the biggest truth. Listen for it." They nodded, and he knew they didn't yet understand. But one day they would. That was enough. Behind them, nobles whispered about his audacity, and Vadran's outrage echoed across the chamber. Yet Elias barely heard them. His focus was already ahead, on the faint, uneven pulse in the walls. The queen reclined against her throne, bored already. "Escort them out," she repeated. But there was no real urgency in her tone. Not yet. Elias rose to his feet, hand closing around the hammer's handle again. His children stayed close, their small bodies pressing against his legs. He guided them toward the gallery with steady steps. If no one else saw the danger, he would at least be near when it came to light. Every part of him knew the crisis was coming, and when it did, they'd remember the man they laughed at, the one who heard the fracture before the Empire felt it. The crystalline arch shivered as Elias stepped into the gallery, his children tight against his sides. The noble's jeers followed him like gnats, but they dimmed beneath the low vibration running through the walls. It was no longer subtle. The pulse of the star core faltered, like a breath caught in a broken chest. A sudden ripple of light ran through the chamber. One of the crystal panels along the gallery wall cracked, a hairline fracture that spread with a sound like ice splitting across a frozen lake. Gasps replaced laughter. For the first time, silence carried weight. Chancellor Vadran's voice rose in forced authority. "Remain calm. The core is stable." But even as he spoke, the harmonic resonance skipped again. The floor beneath their feet thrummed, unsteady, like a drum struck off beat. The twins clung tighter. Quayle's whisper barely reached him. "Papa, it's worse now." Elias nodded once. "I know." He looked down at their frightened faces and forced a small, steady smile. They needed his calm more than anyone needed his voice raised. Another crack burst across the far wall, spraying shards of light. Nobles screamed and pushed against one another, their jeweled robes tangling as panic spread. For all their superiority, they scattered like startled birds. Queen Sarilith stood, her gown blazing with captured starlight. "Contain it," she barked, pointing to her engineers. "Seal the harmonic chamber." Dozens of alien technicians rushed forward, their sleek instruments glowing with shifting glyphs. They waved their devices against the trembling walls, feeding streams of power into the star core. The light surged for a heartbeat, then sputtered, wild and chaotic. The glyphs flickered red. One engineer dropped his tool, voice cracking. "The stabilizers won't respond." The chamber's hum turned into a roar, deeper, uneven, as if something vast beneath them was breaking loose. Elias adjusted his grip on the hammer, its worn leather handle pressing firm into his palm. He took a step closer to the core, his boots ringing against the trembling floor. Every instinct screamed that the danger was minutes, maybe seconds, away from collapse. "Get back," Vadran shouted, shoving through the chaos to block his path. "This is no place for a human servant." The janitor didn't stop. His eyes stayed fixed on the flickering heart of the star core, where light lashed against crystal as though trying to break free. "If it falls, your walls won't matter. Let me through." The Chancellor's mouth opened, ready to spit more venom, but another shockwave ripped through the hall. Chandeliers of living crystal shattered, raining shards that seared the floor with smoking sparks. Nobles shrieked and ducked, clawing over one another to escape. The Queen's voice cracked like a whip. "Fix it, now!" The engineers tried again, chanting commands to their machines. Sparks spat, tools shorted, and one console burst into flame. The smell of scorched air filled the hall. No alien hand could tame the chaos. Elias knelt, placing the hammerhead gently against the trembling floor. He closed his eyes for a breath, listening. The rhythm of instability was clearer than any voice. It reminded him of the engines he had once tended, long before this palace ever knew his name. Machines, whether human-built or alien-forged, all spoke the same language when they were about to die. Leora tugged at his sleeve, her voice trembling. "Papa, they'll blame you." He opened his eyes, steady, and brushed her cheek with a calloused hand. Sometimes blame doesn't matter. Only the fix does. He rose to his feet, hammer in hand, and stepped toward the core chamber. Vaedren tried to block him again, but this time the queen herself intervened. Her gaze was sharp, desperate. "What are you doing, janitor?" "Listening," he answered simply. The single word landed heavier than the roar of the failing core. The queen hesitated, then gestured sharply. Let him pass. The gallery stilled as Elias walked forward, every eye on the man they had mocked minutes before. The hum of the star core rose to a shriek, cracks spiderwebbing across its crystalline cage. Light poured in jagged streams, flaring against his face. He placed a hand against the fractured wall, feeling its violent tremor. The hammer balanced easily in his other hand, not raised yet but ready. He spoke softly, more to his children than to the court. "This isn't the first heart I've heard breaking, and it won't be the last I mend." The chamber's light swelled dangerously, pressing toward collapse. Behind him, nobles wailed, and Vaedren hissed curses, but Elias stood calm in the storm, a man whose quiet truth carried more power than all their jeweled arrogance. This was no longer about humiliation, it was about survival, and for the first time the Empire would have to depend on the janitor they despised. The fractured light pulsed against Elias's face, throwing jagged shadows across the gallery. Every noble in the hall held their breath as the janitor pressed his palm to the trembling wall. The star core groaned like a wounded beast, its rhythm breaking down faster with every surge. He could feel the collapse rolling closer, as certain as a storm front. Behind him, the queen's voice snapped like brittle glass. "Speak! What do you see?" Her usual command carried a note of fear now, sharp and unguarded. He didn't turn. "The lattice is failing. Your machines feed it power, but they don't understand the fracture. More energy will tear it apart." His tone was calm, but the weight in it drew the attention of every panicked courtier. Vaedren barked out a bitter laugh, though his voice shook. "Do not listen to him, Majesty. He is a cleaner with a hammer, nothing more. Our engineers—" One of the technicians spun on him, terror in her eyes. "Chancellor, he's right. The feedback is accelerating." The glyphs on her shattered tool sputtered, spitting sparks that burned her hand. She recoiled, shaking. The queen's gaze flicked back to Elias. "And you? What do you claim to know that my academy does not?" He finally turned, meeting her eyes across the flickering chamber. For a heartbeat, silence pressed against the roar. His children stood behind him, their fear written across their faces, but their trust anchored him in place. He spoke evenly. "Because I built engines like this once, before your empire ever thought to cage a star." Gasps cut through the gallery. A noble hissed, "Lies!" Another muttered, "Impossible. Humans were never—" But the murmurs only fueled the revelation, each denial crumbling beneath the weight of his quiet certainty. The queen narrowed her gaze. "You claim the knowledge of a navigator caste? A dead lineage? No human could—" Vaedren stepped forward, seizing the moment. "Majesty, he deceives you. A washed-out laborer spinning tales to elevate himself. His children are half-breeds. What better mask for ambition than pity?" But another voice rose, uncertain but carrying. An older advisor, his eyes narrowing as if recalling a memory. "Rourke, I've heard that name. Among the lost fleets that fled the outer war. Navigators who vanished when the gates collapsed. His words hung heavy, and murmurs shifted from scorn to doubt. Elias said nothing, letting the recognition ripple through them. He didn't need to embellish. The truth carried itself, stark and unadorned. The Queen's fingers tightened on the arm of her throne. For the first time, she seemed less certain of her power. If what you say is true, then prove it. Show me this knowledge. The floor lurched violently, throwing nobles against the crystalline walls. Shards rained down like burning hail. Elias steadied his children, pulling them close, then planted his feet and raised the hammer slightly, not as a threat, but as a promise. Proof won't come from words. He stepped into the core chamber, the light scorching against his skin. The fractured hum shook his bones, but he listened, following the broken rhythm like a trail. His mind moved with old instincts, remembering the ships he had once kept alive when whole crews depended on his judgment. Machines didn't care about pride or titles. They either lived or failed, and he knew how to read the difference. "Papa," Leora's voice trembled, but he glanced back, giving her the smallest nod. That was all she needed to stand firm. He traced the fault lines spreading through the crystal lattice, his fingers hovering over the jagged glow. Each crack sang a different note, and together they formed the discord he had felt earlier. He exhaled slowly, then pointed with the hammer. "Here. If you reinforce this junction, the collapse slows, but only if you strip power from the other channels first." The nearest engineer stammered. "That would destabilize the entire grid. It's already destabilized." Elias cut in, his voice sharp now. "You're feeding the fracture instead of starving it. Do as I say, or you'll be watching the city burn within minutes." The Queen hesitated only a moment before she barked, "Do it!" The engineers scrambled, redirecting power with shaking hands. The core's roar dipped, not silenced but eased, like a beast momentarily calmed. The walls still trembled, but the fractures slowed their spread. A fragile reprieve. The nobles exhaled in relief, though their fear hadn't vanished. Vadran glared, fury twisting his face. "Coincidence," he spat. "A lucky guess." But the older advisor shook his head. "No guess. That was the voice of someone who has listened to dying engines before. Too precise for chance." His eyes narrowed on Elias, and this time his tone carried reverence. Navigator blood does not lie. Elias lowered the hammer, his hand tightening on the handle. He didn't bask in their recognition. He only looked back at his twins, whose small hands clung to each other, steadied by his presence. The Queen's gaze burned, conflicted. "If you truly carry this knowledge, then you may yet save us, but fail, and your life, and theirs, ends with the collapse." He didn't flinch. "I didn't come here to fail." The star core flared again, cracks deepening, forcing another wave of panic through the chamber. The fragile reprieve was ending, and the final test was only beginning. The gallery trembled under the flare of the star core, its fractured glow painting every face in ghostly light. Nobles pressed back against the walls, their finery dulled by fear, while engineers scrambled in a frenzy of glyphs and failing tools. Elias stood firm, hammer in hand, his eyes fixed on the lattice that strained against collapse. The Queen's challenge still rang in the air, sharp as the cracks crawling through the chamber. "Save us, or fall with us." He didn't answer her. He didn't need to. His silence carried a weight no declaration could. He crouched low, pressing the hammerhead against the trembling floor. The vibration shivered up through the handle into his arm. He closed his eyes, mapping the discord in his mind, listening for the weak joints where pressure tore against itself. His twins watched from the threshold, their small hands clasped tightly together. Leora's lips moved in a whisper he couldn't hear, but he knew it was a prayer. Whether to alien gods or to the memory of her human mother, he didn't know. Cale's eyes never left him, wide but steady, as if trying to memorize every motion. Their trust was the anchor that kept his breath even. Another surge slammed through the core, and a panel exploded outward in a shower of shards. The nobles screamed again, scattering across the chamber. A jagged piece seared across the floor, skidding to a stop at the queen's feet. For once, even Sarilith's composure cracked. Her gown's glow couldn't mask the pallor of fear in her face. Vaedren seized the moment, voice shrill with fury. "Majesty, you cannot put our fate in this human's hands. He toys with legend, not knowledge. His presence is blasphemy in this hall." Elias stood, hammer balanced across his shoulder. His eyes met the Chancellor's, calm and unwavering. Blasphemy doesn't steady a failing core. Work does. The words carried more weight than the shouts around him, and even the engineers faltered uncertain. The Queen's voice cut through the noise. "Then prove it. What must be done?" He scanned the chamber, tracing the fractures. His hand moved unconsciously, mapping invisible lines across the air. "The lattice needs release. It's been overfed, stretched too thin. Your machines are too delicate. They fight the pressure instead of guiding it. What it needs is a blunt reset. One strike, at the right junction, to redirect the resonance." The words sent ripples through the chamber. Nobles gasped, horrified. "A strike? With that primitive tool?" one cried, pointing at the hammer. "He'll shatter it entirely," Vaedren sneered, seizing on the panic. "He seeks to destroy what he cannot control." "Majesty, if you let him swing that relic, you doom us all." But Elias ignored them. He was already moving, testing the weight of the hammer in his grip, feeling the balance as though it were an extension of his arm. He remembered the engines of the old fleets, the way metal responded to touch, how one blow could break or mend depending on where it landed. The star core might be alien, but resonance was universal. He turned briefly to his children. His voice softened, just for them. "When you're afraid, remember this. Sometimes the simplest tools fix the grandest problems. Never forget the weight of what you hold." Cale nodded, tears brimming but unshed. Leora squeezed her brother's hand tighter. Their faith was all the confirmation he needed. The Queen's gaze burned into him. "If you fail," she began, but he cut her off gently. "If I fail, none of us walk out of here, so let me do the work." The hall quieted, fear pressing down harder than any command. Engineers stepped aside reluctantly, leaving him a path to the fractured junction. The glow from the core flared, wild and unstable, casting jagged shadows. He approached, each step ringing against the trembling floor. Vaedren hissed from behind. "This is madness. We entrust our lives to a janitor with a hammer?" One of the younger engineers, face pale, whispered back. "Better a janitor who listens than nobles who close their ears." The words rippled through the crowd, a seed of doubt turning toward something larger. Elias reached the heart of the lattice. The crack blazed bright, bleeding energy with every pulse. He lifted the hammer slowly, steadying his breath. Every eye in the chamber followed the motion. This was no longer just about a fix. It was about who could be trusted when arrogance failed. He whispered under his breath. Not to the nobles, not to the Queen, but to the children who would remember this moment long after. "This is for you." He adjusted his stance, the hammer poised for its decisive strike. The chamber's hum rose to a shriek, as if daring him to act. And in that breathless pause, With the Empire's fate trembling before him, Elias prepared to bring the hammer down. The hammer fell. Its head struck the lattice with a thunderous ring, not the shattering chaos the nobles feared, but a resonant note that cut clean through the storm. The chamber vibrated, every fracture humming in sudden harmony. The star core flared once, violent, blinding, then steadied, its rhythm smoothing like a wounded heart finding strength again. The roar subsided into a low, steady pulse. For a moment, silence reigned. Nobles crouched where they had fallen, wide-eyed. Engineers stared at their glyphs in disbelief as readings shifted from red to gold. The crystalline walls stopped trembling. The city was safe. Elias lowered the hammer slowly, its weight heavy but familiar in his hands. He breathed out, steady and unshaken, as if the strike had not just saved an empire but confirmed what he had always known, that sometimes the simplest hand guided the grandest machine. Behind him, the twins gasped with relief. Leora let go of her brother's hand and ran to him, her small arms wrapping tight around his waist. Kyle followed, his face pressed against his father's side. Their fear melted into quiet pride, and Elias bent, resting the hammer across his knees so he could hold them close. The only victory that mattered was the calm in their hearts. But the silence did not last. Murmurs spread like fire. He saved it. A human janitor. Navigator blood, it must be. The tide of voices grew, disbelief giving way to awe. Queen Saralith rose slowly from her throne, her gown's glow dimmed beside the light of the core. Her eyes locked on him, sharp and unblinking. "You," she said, voice lower now, carrying something that sounded almost like reverence. A servant no longer. Vaedren stumbled forward, desperate to reclaim control. Majesty, it was chance, a fluke of brute force. He endangered us. Enough. The Queen's command cut him down sharper than any blade. She descended the steps of her throne, the crystalline hem of her gown whispering against the floor. When she stopped before Elias, the gallery held its breath. He met her gaze without bowing, not in defiance, but because dignity demanded it. The hammer rested by his side, his children pressed close. "You carry knowledge our empire forgot," she said. "You hold a lineage we mocked. And before this court, before my throne, you have proven what arrogance blinded us to." Nobles shifted uneasily, their jeweled collars rattling as they realized what was being spoken aloud. Recognition, vindication, a reversal no one could deny. The Queen inclined her head, not much but enough that the hall gasped. Alien royalty had bent, if only slightly, to a human janitor with a hammer. Elias didn't smile. He only replied with quiet steadiness. "All I ever wanted was to keep my children safe. If that lesson is worth remembering, then let it stand." Saralith's eyes flicked to the twins, their hybrid faces glowing softly in the light of the restored core. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber, "it is time our empire stopped measuring worth by bloodlines and jewels. Today, a human saved us all." The words struck harder than the hammer ever could. Nobles bowed their heads, some out of shame, others out of dawning respect. The ripple spread outward, a shift too large to be undone. Vaedren tried once more, his voice breaking. "Majesty, if we elevate him, what becomes of order?" The Queen's gaze cut him down. "Order is not maintained by lies, it is rebuilt by truth." The Chancellor fell silent, his ambition crushed beneath the weight of the moment. Elias stood taller, not because he had sought their recognition, but because the burden had lifted. He glanced down at Leora and Kyle. "It's over," he whispered. They clung tighter, safe in the truth of his words. The hammer, once mocked as a relic, now gleamed with symbolic weight. It was no longer just a tool of labor. It was the mark of a man who had restored balance where power had failed. The chamber slowly emptied, whispers trailing like shadows. But the memory of the strike would not fade. It would echo across spires and fleets, told and retold, the day a janitor silenced a star corps with a single blow. Later, when the chamber was quiet, Elias led his children out through the same crystal halls where they had been ridiculed. This time, no noble laughed. Some even stepped aside, eyes lowered in respect. He paused once at the archway, turning back to glance at the core now pulsing steady, its light calmer than it had been in years. His voice carried low, but it was enough. They thought I was only a janitor. They'll remember I was a father first. He guided his twins into the glowing night beyond, the stars above no longer symbols of distance, but of possibility. For the first time, the Empire had seen the truth, that dignity wasn't granted by titles but proven by actions, and that truth would spread far beyond this hall. If you've ever seen dignity restored in the unlikeliest hands, subscribe now. Tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?